I decided to study English literature at undergrad because I genuinely believe books can change the world. They reflect society, they expose the horrors of humanity, oppression, and violence whilst evoking empathy. Every book written can tell us something about the society we live in, something about our needs or desires, something about the past, present, or future state of the world, and about our wrongdoings towards each other, whether in the form of fiction or non-fiction. I decided to study English literature because representation matters, because ideas matter, because social commentary matters, because interpreting matters, because critically engaging with the world and media around us matters, and because we can learn a lot about what we are trying to escape through the forms of escapism we prioritize. In fact, my main issue with English literature as a field is that it often forgets where the reader is situated in this exchange of ideas. But to study English literature or to read at all is to learn about sociology, psychology, history, politics, activism, just to name a few. It's present in fantasy, romance, in literary criticism, in our classics and children's books. It's everywhere. So opening up TikTok to see people arguing that Booktok, and by extension reading, is not inherently political actively scared me. Because this is coming from the people of my generation. The people who grew up on dystopian books and somehow have seemed to completely miss the point of them. So today we're going to talk about books as political manifestations, as political threats, as vehicles for representation, and as something that we should be reading as political. Because whilst they may not be detailing a political party's manifesto within their pages, they are reflecting the world back to us. And we're going to talk about apolitical reading, because I think it's a dangerous pursuit that leads to willful ignorance. Words have the power to change us, and they have the power to change the world, to make us knowledgeable and empathetic people that are able to consider things outside of our own slim worldviews. It's why I've always dreamed of being an author. It's why I have a BA in English literature, and it's why I read. Part 1. Book bans. If books were apolitical, we would see no need to ban them. And we would not be opposed to people burning them because we would not see a value in what is being destroyed. The power of books, or any media that we engage with, is that it reflects something back to us. So in reading, we are engaging in a political conversation, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. Because the people in power who attempt to ban books are distinctly aware of it. If we learn anything from history, it's that we cannot and should not be complacent. Rights we believe are set in stone can be stripped away seemingly out of nowhere because we let one too many things go. Because we excuse one thing that leads to excusing more things. Because we don't keep fighting. Because we become complacent at where we are and think that is as good as it can get. And because we don't keep pushing for progress. The first thing I think about when I think of book bans is Nazi Germany. Perhaps that says a bit about the education system in Britain and what history we learn over and over again, but nonetheless, the thought of book bans conjures a fiery image. It's one of threat and censorship. There was a strict sense of othering established through the policing of society and media under Nazi rule. And this was not just a policing or censorship of books that were seen as un-German by the Nazi Party, but a policing of who could exist in society itself. The targeting of Jewish people and their property in Kristallnacht or Night of the Broken Glass, alongside the internment of marginalized groups into concentration camps, and the horrifying death rate of minority groups in Nazi Germany, all existed because of the same ideology that was behind banning books. They wished to control the ideas that people were exposed to and unite people against a common enemy, the other. A Pew Research Center study in 2014 found that in the United States, those with a higher level of education are more likely to be liberal than those with less education. So, although this research took place in a very different political context than Germany of the 1930s, I think it's interesting to consider how students who arguably are usually considered to be a very liberal group were involved with censorship through book burnings. In May 1933, Nazi-dominated student groups started engaging in public book burning under the principle that these books were seen as un-German, which is a Nazi rhetoric that meant to divide what it meant to be German and non-German, emphasizing this them and us mentality. This occurred in 34 university towns and cities where works by Jewish, liberal, and leftist writers were publicly burned in a symbolic ritual of Nazi censorship. A more recent example of censorship I learned about embarrassingly late into my young adult life is Section 28 of the Local Governments Act in the UK, which was enacted in May 1988 under the government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and this prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. What this meant is teachers often feared for their jobs if they mentioned even their own same-sex partners or challenged homophobic bullying in schools. And having queer books in school libraries was impossible to conceive. Interesting to note is this legislation came about in part due to a children's book. The book was called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, and it was a book that was attempting to teach children about different types of family dynamics and family relationships. You would argue this is a good thing. It makes it so children are less likely to bully or pick fun at someone who has a loving family that just looks a little bit different to what they are used to. At the time, Margaret Thatcher spoke on Section 28 in its context, which just proves the type of othering ideology that was behind the legislation. Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start to life. I just have so many issues with that statement. Education is a source of socialization at a formative time of our lives. And exposure to different ideas is how we teach critical thinking and acceptance. But the idea of those things was completely stripped away by refusing to allow exposure to different viewpoints. The law was repealed in Scotland in 2000 and in the rest of the UK in 2003, which, for context, is a year after I was born, and it seems impossible to conceive for me that this legislation existed in my lifetime. Especially when in 2013, the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, which legalized gay marriage in the UK, gained royal assent only a decade after Section 28 was repealed. I will explore a little bit more about why representation matters in the next section of this video, but we cannot expect people to move forward in acceptance if we are not exposed to viewpoints that champion it. And that's often why books are banned, because they pose threats to the way that people in power wish for us to think. And just like Section 28, the United States seems to be renowned for banning books these days, especially under things like Don't Say Gay bills, which seem to just be Section 28 across the pond in new packaging to me. And I've heard for years of high schools and libraries attempting to ban specific books. One that I've heard over and over and over again is Looking for Alaska by John Green, due to what is perceived as sexual content. Now, anyone who has read Looking for Alaska will know that sexual content is essentially boiled down to one blowjob scene that is clumsy and described clinically and does not promote teen sex in any way due to the sheer awkwardness of the encounter. It's a minute detail of a wider book that, for many like me, was powerful for the same reason that Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky was powerful. Because I may not have the exact experiences of American high school that was detailed in those books, but I did know what it was like to be those kids. The outcasts, the ones who felt like they didn't matter, the ones who searched for love and belonging in their friendships and used those friendships like armor. I related to those books because I know what it's like to feel so much, so strongly, and to question how to get out of the labyrinth of suffering. And reading books like Looking for Alaska and Perks as a teenager, they just made me feel a little bit less alone. Which means they spoke to a systematic failing of teenagers who feel so strongly yet are so often trivialized. Obviously, the banning of books in the United States is getting more and more targeted with each article that seems to be coming out about it. And data from the American Library Association suggests between January 1st and August 31st, 2024, American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom tracked 414 attempts to censor library materials and services. In those cases, 1,128 unique titles were challenged. In the same reporting period last year, the American Library Association tracked 695 attempts with 1,915 unique titles challenged. Though the number of reports to date has declined in 2024, the number of documented attempts to censor books continues to far exceed the numbers prior to 2020. So censorship in libraries and censorship in schools seems to still exist in a really heightened way compared to what I was hearing even when I was a teenager. And for context, I'm 22. I was not a teenager that long ago. And the power of books means there are entire novels that address the ideas of book banning and censorship. The existence of them resists the ideas explored within them, which lets us know as readers the freedom of thought we would lose if we didn't have these books themselves. There's famous examples in Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, George Orwell's 1984, and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which discuss censorship and surveillance. But the entire dystopian genre exists to tell us what we stand to lose if we remain ignorant to politics. And a part of reading is realizing how close our reality is to being something completely different. Perhaps another angle to view book bans from is Oscar Wilde's view on what was considered immoral in his day. The books that the world calls immoral are books that show the world its own shame. This quote is also telling of the political nature of books, because it reminds me so specifically of how we're taught history with a British-centric view, or how when GCSE reform happened, English literature GCSE became focused on British authors, not any author who writes in English in the English literature canon. And that canon does extend far beyond just British literature, I assure you that. The books that are often deemed suitable in these contexts don't challenge the mainstream widely accepted depiction of events or viewpoints. Books, in this way, can be controlled to create a general consensus and then demonize any books that would allow the readers to think about challenging the system itself. And I can't consider the power books hold that people find threatening enough to need to ban without also briefly mentioning the declining rates of literacy and public funding for libraries. I'm not going to go conspiracy theorist on you. I don't think governments are purposely lowering literacy rates because that's not conducive to a workforce, but I might argue that they aren't doing a whole lot to address the rapidly declining literacy rates and access to literature. Because as we discussed earlier, people with a higher level of education, and therefore we can infer a higher literacy level, are more likely to be liberal, which opposes ideas of censorship. Part 2: Why Representation Matters. Representation is one of the most important tools we have in the search for understanding, because it not only allows us to understand other people, but it allows us to understand ourselves, to question and explore things about the world, and to form our own opinions rather than just taking on the opinions gifted to us by society or our families or one-sided media and news. Representation matters for everyone because it impacts us all. And in books, it acts as a portal, taking us to viewpoints and experiences that we may have otherwise never encountered. The representation my research has focused on in the past is both bisexual and mental health representation. So that is the examples I'm going to use in this section. My undergrad dissertation focused a lot on why authentic bisexual identity representation is important in young adult fiction, because it can act as a type of pseudo role modeling in a biphobic society where young bisexual people do not have access to positive representations of what it means to be bisexual. This can help with stable identity formation in bisexual individuals, but it can also help with creating a more widely accepted and less stereotyped version of bisexuality for others to encounter. And I suggest this can reduce what Maya calls minority stress in the minority stress model, which is the additional stress experienced by minority groups as a direct result of their minority identities, which can lead to worse mental health outcomes for them. In 2020, the Royal College of Psychologists published a blog post that states, For reasons that have yet to be significantly explored, many studies show that bisexual people suffer from worse mental health than lesbian and gay communities. And any of you who have encountered any kind of queer discourse will know that the LGBTQ plus community as a whole have worse mental health outcomes than their straight counterparts. I would suggest, with the help of Myers Minority Stress Model, that the reason for these worse mental health outcomes is a lack of support from society and from peer groups that can lead to the stereotypes and biphobic negativity that they experience to be internalized, causing bisexual people to experience a mental strain as the social perception of their identity is not congruent with their experience of it. Similarly, without positive role models or representation, it is hard to fight against these ideas, leading to bisexual individuals to view themselves and their identities as wrong rather than the social environment. This is why representation matters, because if a book can reach out to just one person and show them they're more than stereotypes, that there is hope, then that can help to mitigate minority stress. This is why books are innately political, because the choice of who does and does not get shown in books on their front covers and in media more generally, there is a choice informed by a history heavy with political implications that have informed biases that operate today, even if we are not conscious of them. So every time you read a book that is not written by a white, straight, cis, able-bodied, middle to upper class man, you are making a political choice. And every time you read a book that does not focus on a white, straight, cis, able-bodied, middle to upper class man, you are making a political choice. What we produce and what we interact with as a society showcases what we value. And for a long time, those authors, the white men, were the only ones told that their voices mattered because they were the ones who got to decide what mattered in society. That stretched to both who was allowed to write the stories that were published and who those stories were written about. The more we read and engage with books written by or about people with minority or oppressed identities, we place economic power in their stories, and so it is more likely that more of those stories are published in the future. Which means that any of us who are made to feel like outsiders or that we don't fit would be able to walk into a bookshop and find ourselves reflected back to us from the shelves. But why is that important? Well, I want to share with you a quote that has really stuck with me since I heard it about representation, and it's by Dr. Poonam Krishnan, who performed the first Bollywood dance on Strictly Come Dancing, and she said that you can't be what you can't see. We are shown the possibilities of who we are and who we could be by representation, which I argue is one of the most important things that media does. And I also argue that this could be even more important in books because there is a level of self-projection that can be achieved within them that really allows us to envision ourselves occupying different futures. What representation does is it tells us that our stories matter, that we matter. Good representation also invites in those who are not directly represented to hear what a story has to say. And authentic representation can help us to navigate the difficulties and questions we may harbor about our own identities. Speaking specifically of the power of representation in children's literature, Jennifer from the blog On the Book Street says, "It is particularly important for children to see themselves within stories so they know their own experiences are valued. When they are not, literature begins to shape a way of thinking that some scenarios are restricted for a certain type of person." So if we aren't seeing ourselves represented in real life, and we aren't seeing ourselves represented in books or media, then it becomes significantly easier to listen to the voices of people who say that people like us or people of a certain group shouldn't do certain things. It becomes easier to internalize negative opinions of ourselves because we don't have access to counter narratives. And if no one experiences challenges to these ideas, they're allowed to prevail in society. Part 3 is the art separate from the artist. So I say that reading is a political act because books themselves are political things. But if books are political things, then we have to acknowledge that the personal politics of authors influences the stories they write. And this is where many will argue to separate the art from the artist, which is a conversation that I find very difficult. I have studied and thus purchased works by authors who are long dead that now I would consider deeply problematic. But their work, held to the standards of today, can tell us a lot about the difference in viewpoints between then and now. The fact that these books have stood the test of time suggests an acceptance of the politics of an author and their work because it was popular enough to not fade out of existence. So there is something we can learn from it, which to me means there is arguably merit in reading these books. And I do think there is a benefit to engaging with ideas different from our own. It helps us to form a viewpoint and it challenges us, thus strengthening what we believe. But that's why I think places like libraries are important, because I don't agree with giving current living authors my money if they oppose my politics. And at times, that really hurts. Like when J.K. Rowling, who wrote a series that I fell in love with at the age of 3, where one of the main messages I took away from it is that people who are different shouldn't be feared or shunned, came out with comments that directly demonized the trans community. I may have grown up loving that series, but the author's opinions and the platform she has to share them causes direct harm to a community that I am an ally to. So I've turned away from engaging with that material in any way that the author can profit from. Because whilst I may enjoy that series, my enjoyment will never be more important than the existence of an entire community. I cannot separate the art from the artist here because supporting the art is supporting the author and therefore increasing her influence to spread vitriol. In a Happy Dancing newsletter on buttondown.com, the ability to separate art from the artist is also considered, but this time as a matter of an author's position and privilege in relation to majority identities. So I have to start off by confessing that this hypothetical separation of the person from the thing they created always rankles me a little bit, because I don't think marginalized creators, including trans creators, ever quite get that luxury. Our identities are always going to be bound up with the stuff we create, even if we aren't explicitly writing about our own marginalization, and we're deeply dependent on our own communities to support us. If you are not viewed immediately as a mainstream creator, your life is going to be scrutinized a lot more no matter what you do. So I think separating the art and the artist sits on this fault line between artists of the past and artists of the present. Because we can gain value from reading from problematic people, but I think in doing so, we have to acknowledge their problematic behaviors and views and understand how social context surrounding those things has changed, which may affect how a reader of today interacts with that material compared to a contemporary audience of the author. But I do not think it's productive to separate living and profiting artists from their art, nor to continue to revere this art when uplifting this may uplift authorial voices that are causing direct harm to marginalized groups. There are ways to critically engage with this material still, to read it and consider how an author's experience and personal politics may influence the stories they write or the narrative choices they make. And these are ways that do not allow the author to profit off of them and do not increase the sales of those books that suggest the author's views are popular ones. Instead, you can borrow books from libraries or you can get them secondhand from charity shops or online on eBay or Vinted or Worlds of Books. Caitlin McCracken wrote an opinion piece in the Asbury Collegian discussing this topic where she suggests separating the art from the artist can be a helpful phrase, especially when addressing artists from the past. We can recognize art's impact and the lessons we can learn from it, yet we also need to recognize the artist's messiness. We can't continue to brush the issues under the rug when talking about that art, but we also can't allow it to push us to ignore the art and its effect on us as individuals and culture as a whole. For the artists who still have artistic power, we can't empower their bigotry or harmful ideas and behavior. Separating the art from the artist should be used as a tool, not as an excuse. Obviously, here I've used one example that is overwhelmingly relevant to the communities that I exist within and around. But the stance I've come to is one that exists as a framework, which can be widely applied when considering what it means to responsibly and critically engage with books. Part 4, we need to do better. So what's the point? What's the point in trying to find fun in reading when it carries the weight of politics? Well, quite frankly, I think that is the point. For so many of us, we grew up with politics being actively inaccessible or unwelcoming to us. It was being confused when we saw groups of politicians jeering at each other across the House of Commons, or else being told to never trust a politician. In my case, I was turned away from politics A level at an open evening at my sixth form because the head of the department judged me on how I looked. I was wearing a full face of makeup and a miniskirt, rather than asking what my grades were or what my interests were. He just told me that it's a very hard subject and maybe I should think about something else. Which is funny because 2 years prior, I won a public speaking competition talking about equality and acceptance in the face of racism, homophobia, and misogyny, stood in council chambers at the age of 13. So I've often been made to feel that political debates weren't for me. But standing up for people, for equality, for what I felt was a given, treating people with kindness, respect, and acceptance as long as their viewpoints do not harm others, all of that came easy to me. And all of that was engaging with politics. Reading The Hunger Games was an inherently political act that I engaged with at the age of 10, which highlights the way that we can glamorize and desensitize audiences to even the most abhorrent of acts. Like a game where children kill each other, and they are more likely to be picked for that game, that death sentence, if they are poor and need additional help with food. It is infused with politics, to the point that if you refuse to see the politics, you become a mirror of the spectators of the Capitol, watching children kill each other for entertainment. Romance books inherently are political because they reflect our ideas about romantic dynamics, how sex and marriage should be policed, and also they let us decide our own worth in romantic relationships. We come to understand what about the relationships we read about are healthy and what we would stand for in our own relationships. And escapism is inherently political because it suggests something about real life that needs to be escaped. Is it because fantasy worlds are far enough detached from ours that it's easier to conceptualize facing both physical and metaphorical dragons there? Or is it because our own world is overwhelming and we feel like we have no support in our darkest of days, so we would rather run away and go somewhere else than face that reality? Do we escape because we are struggling to find hope outside our front doors? And why is that? Now, don't get me wrong, not all books hold the politics that will galvanize a revolution, but all of them hold politics in some way. And by failing to understand that, we miss the genius of books. But we also miss understanding ourselves and our personal values that drive us to interact with certain types of media over others. I personally prioritize reading queer books. Some in the cases of non-fiction analysis of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation like Section 28. Others memoirs about the women who cared for the gay and bisexual men affected by the AIDS crisis when no one else would. And some that are cozy romances with a queer lens. Because through engaging with these books, I get to learn an entire history that the education system and even my English lit degree failed to discuss. I see the ability for love and happiness in relationships that when I was younger, I didn't really get to see until Glee. And now I do have critiques of some of that representation. Because through searching out, buying, and talking about queer books, I helped to make the production of them seem valuable to publishers. Failing to read with some critical awareness of politics and context means we fail to understand why books are written at all. Cassandra Neace for Book Riot sums up my stance pretty perfectly. Reading cannot be separated from politics or societal concerns. We as readers can choose to be conscious of that relationship, or we can choose to ignore it. But that doesn't mean that we can change that fact, nor should we attempt to do so. And Michelle Gonzalez mirrors this idea because it doesn't matter what the intention of the author is. Reading is learning. Instead of learning to uphold harmful political views, values, beliefs, or even stereotypes, we should learn to challenge and dismantle them. What better way to do that than through books? Reading can make a difference in who we are and what we believe. Being aware of that fact is a lot more productive than trying to separate reading from politics. You may want to claim that your reading pursuits are separate from politics, and you may actively engage to try and make them so, but that pursuit of an apolitical reading experience is in itself a political choice. Because the books we read and the authors we read from are in conversation with us as readers, creating emotional responses and making us think in new ways. Being willfully ignorant to that is a political choice. But personally, I think the point of reading is to understand something in some way about the world and each other. By failing to engage with the politics, you're missing the point.